If someone has ruled you for 40 years without ever asking, "Do you still want me here?" Is he a president or an occupier? In today's Africa, people can live stream every meal, but still don't know when or if they'll get to vote. Politics here isn't just policy, it's poverty, it's blood in the streets, it's silence in the ballot box. And in Cameroon, where President Paul Biya has clung to power for over 4 decades, this silence has become deafening. The year is 2025. The country is simmering not with civil war, but with a single haunting question. Can a nation still be called a nation if its people no longer believe in the vote? As elections are delayed yet again and opposition voices vanish in the night, hope doesn't come from the United Nations or international watchdogs. It comes from somewhere far less expected, Burkina Faso. More specifically from a man, President Ibrahim Traoré, a leader who holds no elections, a general who dissolved his parliament, a man who proudly wears the label of a dictator, and yet he has become a symbol of resistance in a country he does not rule. And that terrifies Paul Biya, not the guns, not the protests, but the shifting of belief. Because when people in one country start chanting the name of another country's leader, like he's their savior, the revolution has already begun. Cameroon and Burkina Faso, 2 countries separated by miles, cultures and history, now stand on opposite ends of a silent war. Not a war fought with tanks or soldiers, but a war of philosophies, generations, and legitimacy. On one side is Paul Biya, 91 years old, the master of political endurance, a man who outlived the Cold War, multiple French presidents, and the Arab Spring, yet still clings to power under the banner of order and stability. His rule has been shaped by one strategy: delay, everything deny, nothing disappear, dissent. Elections are announced and postponed. Opposition is tolerated then outlawed, and the people fed just enough hope to stay passive, but never enough to feel powerful. On the other side, Ibrahim Traoré, 36, a former soldier turned head of state in Burkina Faso. But unlike Biya, Traoré doesn't pretend. He openly rejects elections, declares democracy a failed colonial export, and dismantles every Western-style institution he inherited. To the international community, he's dangerous. But to a growing number of African youth, he's a mirror, a painful one. Because in a world of hypocritical democracies, at least Traoré doesn't lie. And this is where the real threat begins. Because Paul Biya still wears the mask of legitimacy. He hosts diplomatic summits, signs trade deals, and delivers speeches about reform, all while quietly arresting journalists, banning political coalitions, and crushing protests. But the arrival of Traoré's ideology, raw, unapologetic, and defiant, exposes the hollowness of Biya's rule. Suddenly, Cameroon's youth have a new vocabulary. They don't say vote him out, they say burn the system. They don't wear t-shirts with party slogans. They wear military fatigues in honor of a president from another country. And when asked who they trust, Biya or Traoré, they choose the one who doesn't need permission to lead. But this isn't just ideology. In early 2025, strange things began to happen across Cameroon's Anglophone regions. Protesters started using encrypted messaging apps, previously only seen in conflict zones. Drones, small and unmarked, buzzed over demonstrations. Activists accessed medical aid, internet equipment, and even security training through anonymous donors, traced back through digital forensics to military networks linked to Burkina Faso. Officially, the Biya regime says nothing, but internally, they're panicking. Cameroon's intelligence agencies begin issuing alerts: non-traditional influence channels detected. Defense reports use code words like shadow donors and ideological contagion. And quietly across the capital, Yaoundé, a new fear sets in. Burkina Faso isn't just exporting weapons, it's exporting rebellion. Then the hashtags begin. Traoré, Cameroon, Burkina knows, Jai Revolt, 1025. None of them come from official accounts. They rise viral and faceless from youth collectives, anonymous writers, underground streamers. But they all echo the same message: Traoré is the future. Biya is the past. And for the first time, Paul Biya's decades-old regime doesn't just feel old, it feels obsolete. Desperation breeds recklessness. The regime launches a nationwide crackdown, dozens arrested for foreign sympathies. A student is expelled for writing a paper comparing Traoré's governance to Cameroon's 1982 constitution. A journalist disappears after asking one question too many about military aid corridors between the two countries. But Biya's problem isn't what Traoré has done, it's what he represents. Traoré doesn't have to invade Cameroon. He doesn't have to fund an uprising. He doesn't even have to tweet, because his presence, his very existence, has become the proof that another kind of leadership is possible. And that idea is the most dangerous weapon of all. It didn't happen in a palace, not in a war room, not even in a high-profile summit. It happened in a modest hotel room in Lomé, Togo, a neutral ground, where cameras don't follow and security forces ask no questions. There, 5 young Cameroonian leaders, students, journalists, and exiled activists met with an unmarked envoy sent from Ouagadougou. The meeting lasted just 2 hours, no recordings, no paper trail, only one condition: the Cameroonians had to believe that change wouldn't come from inside their country, and they did. They signed what is now whispered as the Dark Covenant, an informal agreement that if Biya's regime continued silencing opposition, Burkina Faso would recognize a shadow government in exile based in Ouagadougou. The gesture wasn't just symbolic. It was an open challenge to the illusion that Paul Biya still controlled the narrative. This was the beginning of the power split, not by territory but by truth. Back in Cameroon, change didn't explode, it seeped. Posters started appearing in universities with no logos, no authors, just 4 words: Burkina listens, Cameroon bleeds. Soon after, a viral video showed a young woman, blindfolded, reciting a monologue. We were told to wait, that our time would come, that the ballot would save us, but the ballot came with chains, and the chains came with silence. So now we speak from outside the system. Her voice was raw, unpolished, but it caught fire. Within 48 hours, it had 1 million views across Francophone and Anglophone platforms. The caption, "Traore is my president." The regime scrambled to respond, but for the first time, censorship only made things worse. Every takedown led to 3 reposts. Every arrest sparked new hashtags. Cameroon's digital resistance stopped chasing approval, it started chasing visibility. And then came the twist. Leaked documents allegedly smuggled out by a mid-level official revealed that Cameroon's own security services had flagged foreign ideological infiltration months earlier. Among the evidence, internal memos discussing Traoré doctrine, a term coined to describe the spread of anti-establishment belief systems rooted in Burkina Faso's policies. Worse, the documents showed that Biya's inner circle had planned to launch a fake rebellion, a false flag operation in the Anglophone regions to justify martial law and crush the growing digital uprising. But they were too late. The leak had already gone global. Within a week, major news outlets from Nairobi to Berlin were covering the shadow war in Cameroon. No longer just a domestic crisis, Biya's regime was now facing a public relations catastrophe on a continental scale. And through it all, Traoré never spoke a word. He didn't have to. The silence was louder than any speech. Every time Biya gave a national address, youth online responded with one sentence: "We don't need to hear from you. We already heard from the future." Because in this war, bullets weren't the threat belief was. And belief had already chosen a new capital. By the time the government tried to respond, it was already too late. The country wasn't just slipping through Biya's fingers, it had shifted beneath his feet. The idea of Cameroon as a unified, obedient republic had fractured. Not because of war, not because of sanctions, not even because of a coup, but because of something far more dangerous: irrelevance. In Yaoundé, Paul Biya stood in front of a camera for the first time in months. His face looked tired, stretched thin by the decades. Behind him, the national flag still clean, still untouched. In his speech, he warned against foreign subversion, condemned illegitimate alliances, and promised renewed national dialogue. He even invoked old slogans about unity and resilience. But nobody was listening. Outside the state broadcast center, the streets were empty. Not because of curfews, but because people had stopped caring. The president was speaking, but the people had changed the channel. Across the border in Burkina Faso, something else was happening. A small group of young Cameroonians, now exiles, in Ouagadougou hosted a live stream. No fanfare, no anthem, just a table, a camera, and a statement. We are not claiming power. We are reclaiming our voice. They didn't announce a new government. They didn't call for revolution. They simply read aloud a list of names of activists, arrested students, disappeared families torn apart. Then they read one more list, names of international diplomats who had ignored them. And then one final line. The world may not believe in our fight, but we still believe in each other. That line traveled fast. Within hours, "Worsh believe in each other" trended across West Africa. Artists turned it into songs. Poets turned it into protest verses. It was graffitied on walls from Douala to Dakar. For Biya's regime, this was the most terrifying moment of all, because the people no longer feared them. They had stopped asking for permission. And once fear is gone, power becomes a costume. It wasn't long before institutions began to split. Local officials quietly ignored arrest orders. Judges refused to rule on foreign sympathizer cases. Even members of the military began leaking audio internal conversations, questioning why they were arresting unarmed students, while separatist fighters still roamed free. And through it all, one name kept appearing, not shouted, not plastered on posters, but whispered in meetings, classrooms, and encrypted messages: Ibrahim Traoré. He hadn't stepped foot in Cameroon. He hadn't signed a treaty, but somehow his influence was more real than any embassy, any summit, any speech. Not because he was perfect, but because he proved that even flawed defiance could be more honest than polished tyranny. In the months that followed, something strange began to happen. People stopped waiting for the 2025 elections, not because they were canceled, but because they no longer mattered. Civic groups shifted focus from voting to documenting. Students didn't run for youth councils, they launched media collectives. Protesters didn't chant for change. They recorded everything, knowing that in a regime that fears stories, the most powerful weapon is the archive. International media tried to catch up. The headlines changed from "Cameroon prepares for elections" to "Cameroon's youth prepares for exile." Western diplomats issued generic calls for peace, but no one could deny what was clear. The country had already voted with its silence, and that silence was loud enough to echo beyond borders. Because Cameroon's reckoning wasn't just Cameroon's problem, it was a mirror held up to the entire continent. A question asked not just of Paul Biya, but of every long-serving leader from Kampala to N'Djamena. How long can you hold power if the people no longer believe in it? It also sent a message to the international community, especially those who prefer stability over justice: you can ignore a revolution until it becomes the only thing your embassies are watching. And perhaps above all, it reminded every citizen, not just in Africa, but everywhere, that democracy is not defined by voting alone. It's defined by voice. And when that voice finds new ways to speak through code, through art, through exile, no regime, no border, no constitution can fully silence it. So if you've made it to this point, ask yourself, what do you believe in: more elections, or the people still fighting to make them matter? If this story resonated with you, don't let it end here. Share it, discuss it, challenge what you've been told about power democracy in Africa. Because in a world built on narratives, your attention is ammunition, and your silence is consent. I didn't write this story to make you believe in Ibrahim Traoré. I didn't write it to defend Paul Biya. And I certainly didn't write it just because it sounds cinematic. I wrote it because I believe the people of Africa have spent too long only hearing the truth from the mouths of the powerful. We are living on a continent where power often outlasts justice, where stability is used as a shield to block out accountability, where elections are held not to empower the people, but to decorate tyranny. This fictional tale between Biya and Traoré is not a clash of two men. It's a collision of two concepts: well-dressed deception versus raw, defiant honesty. Paul Biya represents the old model, decades in power systems, fine-tuned to maintain the illusion of democracy while silencing any threat to the status quo. He doesn't need to silence all critics just enough to make everyone else whisper. Ibrahim Traoré, whether you admire or distrust him, has become something else entirely. He doesn't wear the democratic mask, he tears it off, and in doing so, says what millions feel but don't dare speak: we've been lied to for too long. And that is exactly what makes him dangerous, not because he's perfect, but because he's unfiltered. He's not the answer, but in a continent full of unanswered questions, he's the first honest one. That's what scares regimes like Biya's. Not Traoré's army, not his speeches, but his existence, the idea that someone can reject everything they were told to believe in and still lead. And worse, still inspire. This story is fictional, but its emotions are not. Because we've all seen what it looks like when truth is censored in the name of security. We've watched as students are expelled for thinking too loudly, as journalists disappear without trials, as elections are postponed like dental appointments until everyone stops asking when. When I wrote the line, the people no longer feared them. They had stopped asking for permission. I stopped, because I realized that's not a call for violence. It's a whisper of awakening. It's the moment when fear is no longer useful, and therefore no longer powerful. Africa doesn't need more strongmen. We need more honest voices, more teachers who won't be silenced, more youth who dare to archive injustice instead of waiting for justice. And sometimes those voices don't come from ballot boxes. They come from live streams in exile, from murals painted in the night, from poetry smuggled on napkins in prison. We must redefine democracy, not by voting days, but by whether the smallest voice in the country still has a place to speak. This story, though fictional, mirrors a very real crisis. We don't suffer from political instability. We suffer from systemic manipulation. We don't have election delays. We have calculated denial of participation. We don't lack opposition. We suffer from a system that crushes it before it can grow, with laws, arrests, fear, and the world they'll say they care. They'll issue statements of deep concern, but they won't act, because countries like Cameroon are not considered strategic, and unstrategic countries are allowed to collapse quietly. That's why we must tell these stories ourselves, not for international attention, but so the person sitting next to you never forgets what silence costs. The final war isn't over borders, it's over narrative. And if we don't write ours, someone else will. They'll write us as chaos, as victims, as footnotes in someone else's version of events. The Dark Covenant isn't a prophecy, it's a warning that when people stop believing in the system and start whispering the name of a stranger in another country as their only hope, something has already changed. We cannot let the next generation tell this same story again as if collapse is inevitable. We owe them better. We owe ourselves better. And yet, for all the whispers, hashtags, and leaked memos, there was one moment that history will point to not as the climax, but as the irreversible tipping point. It was not a coup, not a protest. It was a funeral. In March 2025, a 19-year-old student named Elvine was buried in her hometown of Biya. Her crime, broadcasting a short podcast episode titled "Democracy Without a Heartbeat." In it, she read excerpts from old independent speeches lines, once delivered by Cameroonian revolutionaries, long forgotten by textbooks. She didn't mention Traoré, She didn't advocate revolt. She simply asked, "What happened to our courage?" 3 days later, her body was found in a ditch. No investigation, no arrests, only silence. But this time, silence didn't protect the regime. Her funeral was live-streamed. Not by mainstream media, but by a network of student phones. As her coffin was lowered, the crowd began to chant softly at first, then louder. She asked a question. That was all it took. Within hours, Elvine's voice, clipped from her final podcast, was remixed into protest songs, dubbed into video tributes, quoted by rappers, printed on shirts. The line, "What happened to our courage?" became a challenge, not to the regime, but to each other. It sparked campus debates, midnight poster campaigns, and one unthinkable act, a letter addressed to the African Union. The letter was short, 1 page, signed by 432 Cameroonian youth organizations, some registered, most not. Its message was blunt: if you won't hear us alive, will you listen to us dead? The African Union never replied, but the silence confirmed what many already believed, that Africa's institutions had become echo chambers for the powerful, not platforms for the people. If justice required diplomacy, then justice would be postponed. But if justice required storytelling, the youth were ready. They began documenting everything, not just violence, but absence. Empty polling stations, vanished opposition parties, censored textbooks. For every act of repression they produced a record, not for courts, for memory. Because when institutions fail, history must become evidence. This strategy wasn't spontaneous. It was shaped not by foreign consultants or NGOs, but by conversations with their Burkina Faso counterparts. Young archivists in Ouagadougou began hosting encrypted workshops: how to hide metadata, how to duplicate footage, how to preserve testimony across borders. It was mentorship through memory. And that's when Biya's regime truly lost control, not of territory but of time. Because while governments fight for the present, rebellions fight for the future. And the future had already begun rehearsing its version of events. Inside Cameroon, a strange duality emerged. On national television, Paul Biya still cut ribbons, still issued statements. But outside those broadcasts, a parallel state was forming, a decentralized, invisible republic, where the president was no longer the president, and legitimacy was no longer printed on ballot papers. In this republic, Elvine was a martyr. In this republic, archives were sacred. In this republic, belief had borders, and Biya wasn't inside them. The shift wasn't visible to everyone. Some still clung to what they knew: order, tradition, the hope that reform might come quietly. But even they stopped arguing, because even the loyalists couldn't explain why a 91-year-old man needed tanks to keep teenagers quiet. Across the continent, leaders watched with unease, not because they feared an invasion, but because they feared exposure. If a country could collapse from within with nothing but whispers and Wi-Fi, then who was truly safe? In Nairobi, newspapers warned of digital destabilization. In Libreville, politicians quietly reviewed their succession plans. In Addis Ababa, AU advisors debated whether youth movements needed official liaisons. But it was too late. Cameroon's descent wasn't chaos, it was choreography. A quiet, precise unraveling of everything that had been staged to look permanent. And through it all, Traoré said nothing. Some called it strategy, others called it arrogance, but those closest to him described it another way: conviction. He didn't need to insert himself into Cameroon's crisis because he had already shown what it meant to choose a side. Not a national side, a generational one. He wasn't leading a rebellion, he was reflecting one. And maybe that was the final lesson, that leadership in the 21st century isn't about commanding crowds or winning elections. It's about becoming a mirror, clear enough, sharp enough, honest enough, that when people look into it, they see themselves and decide to change. Cameroon did not erupt overnight. It leaked, it cracked, it whispered, and then it moved. But even as Cameroon slipped into something unrecognizable, there remained one final illusion. The regime desperately clung to the idea that exile equals defeat. They believed that by pushing dissenters across the border they had won, that a government in exile would be no more than a footnote, a hashtag that would fade, a memory buried under state propaganda. They were wrong, because exile in the age of digital solidarity is no longer disappearance, it's multiplication. In Ouagadougou, what began as a loose group of student exiles evolved into something larger. They called themselves l'Assemblée de Demain, the Assembly of Tomorrow. No uniforms, no formal headquarters. But their actions were precise, strategic, and rooted in collective dignity. They didn't demand to be recognized as the rightful government of Cameroon. They did something far more dangerous. They started governing without permission. They launched an online civic platform called Citoyen 21, where exiled Cameroonians and supporters inside the country could submit anonymous reports of injustice, disappearances, intimidation, arrests. Each report was verified, time-stamped, mapped, and preserved on a blockchain-based ledger. Not for prosecution today, but for justice someday. They organized decentralized scholarships for students expelled for political beliefs, funded not by Western donors, but by diaspora musicians, writers, and entrepreneurs who had grown tired of waiting for foreign help. They created digital libraries of banned books, produced documentaries featuring families whose children vanished after speaking out, trained high school students in encrypted communication and digital journalism. And they did all of this not in defiance of Biya's government, but as if it no longer existed. Because to them it didn't. That mindset was revolutionary. It meant that the battle was no longer about who sat in the presidential palace, it was about who defined reality. And l'Assemblée de Demain was redefining reality with every upload, every meeting, every word written in the margins of censorship. Meanwhile, inside Cameroon, those still loyal to the regime faced a different crisis, not one of fear, but of fatigue. Civil servants who once repeated slogans without question began skipping meetings. Teachers started assigning passages from banned literature, framing them as critical thinking exercises. Police officers began turning off their radios during student gatherings. The regime noticed. They issued memos. They tightened surveillance. But every crackdown now felt like a desperate attempt to rewind a clock that had already struck midnight. And in the background, the name Traoré lingered not as a savior, but as a symbol. He didn't speak, he didn't endorse, he didn't visit. But his example, a leader who defied Western expectations and still held his ground, served as a permission slip for a generation that had long been told to wait their turn. Traoré's silence became a kind of manifesto, because sometimes the loudest thing a leader can do is refuse to interrupt the people when they're finally speaking for themselves. And Cameroon was speaking, through murals painted over police stations at night, through poems written on receipts, through lullabies where mothers whispered, "You will grow up free." This was not revolution in the traditional sense. There were no armies, no official announcements, no battlefields, but there was movement. Relentless, quiet movement like the sea eroding a cliff, one invisible wave at a time. By mid-2025, international observers could no longer pretend it was business as usual. The EU postponed trade negotiations, citing internal transparency concerns. ECOWAS issued a rare internal memo warning of a loss of institutional credibility in Cameroon. Even France, long a backer of Biya, began limiting arms cooperation, fearing reputational damage. But none of these moves mattered as much as what happened in a dusty village school outside Marua. There, a teacher named Joseph, a quiet man in his 60s, ended class one day with an unexpected assignment. "Tonight I want you to ask your parents, do you still believe in the people running this country?" The next day, only half the students came back. The rest were missing or had been removed by parents terrified of what might happen next. Joseph was arrested that week, but his question remained. It floated across dinner tables, passed in text messages, scratched into bathroom stalls at universities. Do you still believe the regime could arrest Joseph, but it couldn't arrest the question? And that was the true collapse not of government buildings, but of legitimacy. Because when a state can no longer survive questions from children, it is no longer a state. It is a costume. And that costume was starting to tear. By the end of 2025, something had changed in Cameroon, not on the surface but in the soul of its people. No flag had fallen, no palace had been stormed, and yet everywhere you looked you could feel the slow unraveling of fear. It wasn't dramatic, it was intimate. It was the mother who for the first time dared to tell her son about the massacre she witnessed in 1992. It was the taxi driver who turned down the volume of state radio and instead played recordings of exiled poets on the morning route. It was the student who printed quotes from Frantz Fanon and taped them to the walls of the school cafeteria, knowing they'd be torn down before noon, but doing it anyway. And in every act, a quiet decision was being made to stop lying to ourselves. Because for too long, entire nations had lived in double lives, what they told their children and what they told the government, what they believed in public and what they whispered in private. But truth once spoken aloud becomes harder to put away, harder to forget. By then, Paul Biya's speeches had become parodies, wooden ceremonial and eerily out of sync with the reality on the ground. He would appear on television to declare national renewal while journalists vanished the same night. He promised youth engagement while universities resembled prisons. He invoked the Constitution, a document so disrespected it might as well have been myth. No one was listening, not even his own ministers. Some had already begun quietly relocating their families abroad. Others stopped attending cabinet meetings altogether. A few began leaving behind subtle hints, unsigned memos, sudden retirements, anonymous leaks. Even the armed forces, once the shield of the regime, began to fracture. Entire units requested reassignment away from urban centers, wary of being asked to fire on their own neighbors. Military chaplains, once silent, began preaching sermons about loyalty to conscience above command. And yet no revolution came, because the people didn't want war. They wanted meaning. They wanted to know that their sacrifices, their vanished friends, their exiled leaders, their silenced teachers had not been for nothing. They wanted to live in a country where elections were not a ceremony, but a covenant, where power was not inherited by age, but earned by trust, where truth was not an act of bravery, but a birthright. Across the ocean, in think tanks and embassies, analysts debated how fragile Cameroon had become. But fragility was never the problem. The problem was invisibility, a society slowly bleeding in silence while the world nodded along with press releases. That silence had now been shattered. And what rose from the cracks was not chaos. It was clarity. A new language emerged, a new imagination, one not built around slogans or saviors, but solidarity. People stopped waiting for heroes. They started becoming each other's witnesses, and slowly something sacred began to return, the belief that we deserve better. Better than a ballot that arrives too late. Better than a constitution that protects no one. Better than a history written only by the victors. In Ouagadougou, the exiled Assembly of Tomorrow began drafting what they called the People's Ledger, a living document of grievances, hopes, and proposals collected from citizens across all 10 regions of Cameroon. It wasn't a declaration of war. It was a blueprint for healing. It listed not just demands, but dreams, not just wounds, but remedies. When asked what they planned to do with it, their spokesperson answered simply, "We are not architects of revenge. We are architects of return." That word return echoed far beyond the document. It became a campaign, a mantra, a promise. Return not to the old system, but to the self, to dignity, to truth, to each other. And that is where this story must end. Not with a bang, not with a coup, but with the slow, unshakable realization that the most powerful revolutions don't begin with violence. They begin with memory, with remembrance of what was stolen, with recognition of what must never be lost again, with the courage to carry forward not because we are fearless, but because we are done being afraid. In this world where headlines chase spectacle, where power masquerades as permanence, and where too many stories go unwritten, this at least must be said: Cameroon did not collapse. It shed its illusions, and in doing so, it gave the rest of Africa, and perhaps the world, a message we cannot afford to ignore, that when a people begin to dream beyond their chains, no ruler, no regime, no lie is strong enough to cage them. Because the future does not belong to those who hold the microphone. It belongs to those who reclaim their voice, one story at a time. So if you're reading this now from a cafe in Yaoundé, a dorm in Douala, or a living room in Paris, remember this: you are not just a spectator of history, you are its author, its editor, its voice. Don't let anyone convince you that your silence is safer than your speech. Don't let any regime convince you that fear is patriotism. And don't wait for perfect leaders to begin the work of change, because sometimes the most honest revolutions are built not by saints, but by survivors. Cameroon is not a warning, it is a wake-up call, not just for Africa, but for every place where people are taught to endure instead of imagine, to obey instead of build, to vote without believing, because the most dangerous lie in any society is this: nothing will ever change, but it will. It already has. And if you felt that truth stir somewhere in your chest, even just for a second, then maybe, just maybe, the revolution is not far away. Maybe it's already begun in you.